The Venezuelan government announced today it will donate $5 million to victims of Hurricane Harvey. In making the declaration, Foreign Minister Jorge Araiza said, quote, "Let not war or threats be imposed, but instead let's impose solidarity. We will always be with the people of the United States and the peoples of the world in difficult times." He said the program has been approved by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, as well as U.S. authorities and local mayors. The show of solidarity from Venezuela comes as the U.S. has imposed harsh sanctions on the country, the strictest to date. Speaking to RT, Foreign Minister Araiza said he believes it's the opposition in Venezuela that should shoulder the blame for new U.S. sanctions he believes they're responsible for.
The most natural reaction of international organizations like the UN would be to recognize that the sovereignty of our country must be respected, curb attempts of interfering into the internal affairs of Venezuela, and refrain from adopting a policy of unilateral sanctions that violate the principles of international law. So that you understand what kind of opposition we have, they have been lobbying, going to Washington to achieve those sanctions against Venezuela. Now they are trying to convince the people of Venezuela that the sanctions are the fault of President Maduro. This is completely absurd, and the world must know this.
Economist and co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Mark Weisbrot, says these sanctions will harm the Venezuelan people. I spoke to Mark earlier and started by asking for his reaction to today's announcement from Caracas.
Well, sure. In the United States, they did. It was a few years ago that there was a letter from members of Congress, I think, that asked all the oil companies operating in the United States if they could help people with fuel oil for the winter in the Northeast, especially. And nobody came forward. And then Citgo, which is owned by Venezuela, said, yeah, we can help. And they gave, it was tens or even possibly hundreds of millions, I think, of dollars of subsidized heating oil all over the, to several states. It was a very big program. It was Joe Kennedy here in the U.S. that helped organize it. And so, yeah, they've always tried to make that point that their fight is not with the people here in the United States, but with the government that was trying to, you know, overthrow their democratically elected government for all those years, and of course still is today. And in the hemisphere, of course, they gave many billions of dollars. In fact, at one point they were providing more aid to the hemisphere than the United States was, despite having an economy that is maybe, or at that time was about 1/30 the size of the United States. So, yes, I think they've always been like that. They've been very solidaristic. Cuba has been like that, of course, as well. Those two countries and a number of the other left governments have adopted an official policy of solidarity in that respect.
This comes as the Trump administration last week imposed unprecedented sanctions on Venezuela. Washington claims these sanctions target the government. Mark, do they?
Yeah, that's the thing I think is a little misleading, the way it's reported in the media, because in most of the media, because they're saying, well, yeah, it's targeting the government, and they're, you know, the sanctions are just cutting off new lending, and some analysts say, well, they're not able to issue new bonds anyway. But I think what's really wrong about that narrative is that, you know, Venezuela, it's true that Venezuela hasn't been able to borrow in the last year or so, but that's not necessarily irreversible. There's a whole set of policy changes they could make that would change their situation. Really declared an economic war on them by saying, no matter what you do, you're never going to be able to borrow. You can't do a debt restructuring, for example, which they came very close to doing last year, towards the end of the year, because if you do a debt restructuring, which can save you billions of dollars in interest and principal payments, debt service, you have to issue new bonds, so they won't be able to do that. And then you have one of the biggest Wall Street financial intermediaries today, announced they weren't even going to let publicly, they weren't even going to facilitate trades or handle trades of existing Venezuelan bonds, which, of course, makes it even also more difficult for anybody investing in Venezuela. They won't be able to get new investments. So this is a really big thing.
These sanctions and the situation you've described will undoubtedly make Venezuela much more dependent on other players like Russia and China for support. As we gear up for the BRICS summit, what role do these two countries play in the saga of Venezuela?
Well, I think especially China, which has a lot of reserves and has loaned something like $60 billion to Venezuela in the past, most of which has been paid back, and I think they really could help a lot, and I think they should, because this is, and both China and Russia have denounced the sanctions. This is a threat to the whole world that Trump can decide the fate of Venezuela. In other words, he's trying to overthrow the government, and he's committed now to destroy what's left of the Venezuelan economy until the government is removed from power. And that is something that the whole world has to care about.
Let's talk about that. A spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry strongly denounced these sanctions, saying, quote, they're clearly aimed at further unbalancing the situation in the country and exacerbating its economic problems. They embolden the irreconcilables who do not see how they can realize their political potential without removing the Venezuelan leaders from office. Mark, how do you assess this read of Washington's strategy?
Well, it's similar to what they did to Nicaragua in the 1980s, although they actually had a military war there as well, where they paid people to try and overthrow the government. And they haven't reached that stage yet here, because it's the 21st century. It's not so easy to get away with. But I think if if Trump went to the United Nations and said, and tried to get a vote in the General Assembly on sanctions, he'd probably get 0 or 1 vote, because this is really, again, it's something that the whole rest of the world finds abhorrent. He's managed to get
the strategy, do you get the strategy, or the sense that the strategy is to push the country to war?
Yeah, I think that, well, first he's trying to force them into default because by hurting their finances, he can push them to default, which create a whole other set of mess in Venezuela. I mean, he's even cutting off dividends from Citgo, for example, with the sanctions. And yeah, it does push the country more towards civil war, because if you think about it, look at the opposition, they're supporting the sanctions. The main coalition is supporting the sanctions, and it makes them look completely treasonous, and it further polarizes the country. And I think that's the opposite of what you need, because you really need a negotiated solution there. And what Rubio and Trump and the extreme right here are basically saying is we don't want a negotiated solution. We want regime change, and we're going to get it by destroying the economy. And they did do that to Nicaragua, by the way, as well. During they had an economic embargo beginning in 1985. So it's very similar in that respect.
All right, economist, co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research, Mark Weisbrot, thanks a lot.
Thank you.